So the first mixing tip that I'd like to cover is setting levels for a mix in mono. So first we'll cover why you may want to use this approach on your different mixes, and how you can help improve your mixes by practicing this skill, and then we'll do a quick demo that's more practical of this technique to see how this can actually be used in a real mixdown. So mixing in mono works for any style of music. This goes from acoustic tracks, tracks that were recorded with bands, hip-hop songs, and even heavy electronic songs as well. And there's actually a lot of hip-hop mixes that are done almost exclusively in mono, which really helps you whenever it comes to leveling and placing the different elements inside of your tracks. So a lot of the more early Kendrick Lamar records were actually mixed primarily in mono, which is part of why they sound so balanced and punchy, is because they heavily utilize this technique. So the track that I'm working with today, you could download with the course resources if you want to play around with these different stems. I was switching things up today. I tend normally to do a lot of electronic tracks, but in this case I have this more acoustic folk track, and I figured it'd be fun to switch things up. But the reason I'm using this rather than an electronic song is because setting levels in mono is really helpful for things like drums. So placing the different snare, overheads, and hi-hat elements in terms of volume, it's a lot easier to get everything leveled in mono. So that's why I'm using these acoustic drums today in this example. But again, this technique works for any style of music. It doesn't have to be something that's a live recorded band. So by summing everything to mono, it temporarily allows you to change the way that you're hearing the song. It enables you to more clearly hear the different volume levels and adjustments that you're making. So I find whenever I sum everything to mono, it makes it easier to hear 1 or 2 decibel changes, and it makes my mixing process a little bit more accurate, and I'm able to really dial in the volume of each of these individual adjustments inside of a mix. So whenever you're starting mixing in mono, don't just do what I used to do, which is just slap a stereo to mono plugin at the end of my mix down, switch it on, just be like, sure, it sounds great, and then call it good. Whenever I started to take the time to actually mix in mono, and to spend a majority of my mix while in mono, I found that it really helped me a lot in terms of getting a lot of clarity and balance to my overall mixes, and especially with things like EQ changes, which we'll cover in the next video. So it's worth spending considerable time in mono during your mixing process, and switching it on and off rather frequently, rather than just putting a stereo to mono plugin on at the end, switching it on for a moment and just checking things really quick, and then turning it off. Take the time to really mix in mono, and you'll see a big benefit on your mixdowns. So this is pretty easy to set up inside your digital audio workstation. Basically, all this is doing is summing the left and right channels together into a single channel. That what you hear on the left speaker is the same as what you hear on the right speaker. So here you can use any stereo to mono plugin. So your digital audio workstation should have one built in. In the case of Ableton Live, it's going to be the utility plugin. And there's a mono button on here, which just sums everything automatically. But you can always download a VST plugin to do this as well if you're working inside another digital audio workstation that doesn't have one of these plugins built in. But there should be something, it's probably labeled stereo to mono, or stereo utility plugin or something like that. There should be a built-in plugin that enables you to do this. So you'll want to go ahead and put this on your master channel. I'll just remove that for now and hop on over to my master channel. So that way everything is summed to mono, not just the piano plugin. And then whenever we're ready, we could just swap it over to mono. So the track we're working on sounds like this. Everything's pretty out of balance when it comes to volume levels, but we'll be adjusting that here in a moment. So we have these drums, and these drum overheads are nice and wide. We have some acoustic guitars, some electric guitars, which I've grouped. And then we have some piano, upright bass, percussion, and then all these nice drum tracks. So what I want to show you first is how mixing in mono makes it easier to hear small decibel changes. Let's go ahead and hop on over to our snare drum. I'll just go ahead and solo that. And what I want to demo here is how adjusting the volume level inside of mono makes it easier to hear smaller, more subtle changes. So right now, if I adjust this -6 decibels, you hear a subtle change, but it's not going to be super drastic. And this is also dependent on your speaker setup as well. The speakers that I mix on are the greatest, so this change is a bit more subtle. But if you're on a nicer set of studio speakers, more subtle volume changes will be a bit more drastic. So it just depends on how good your system is, but that's why I mix a lot in mono, because it kind of helps make up for some of the problems in my room that I mix in. So let's go ahead and demo this. I'm going to move this down -6 decibels. So you can hear that there is a change, but it's not a super drastic change. We hear a small adjustment in volume, even though that's about a 6 decibel change in volume. Now let's sum this to mono. and listen to how that change becomes a little bit more evident. So because we're not being distracted by the different stereo information that's inside of these drums, it makes it a bit easier to hear exactly what we're doing. So it just kind of helps focus everything. The other added bonus of setting levels in mono is that it actually changes the whole way that our mix sounds. So everything sounds very narrow and in your face. Sounds like it's happening directly in front of you rather than being super wide. So it changes your listening environment without changing the frequency response. So it's a good way to kind of check your mixes to see if you got used to a problematic frequency that you need to remove, or to a snare drum that's way too loud in terms of a mix. So basically what we'll do now in this video is just go through an entire mix and set the levels as we go, sometimes switching off the mono plugin to show you what everything sounds like in stereo, and we'll just be doing this to set the overall levels and balance for a whole track. This process takes quite a bit of trial and error, but I want to show you what this is like in an actual mixdown, and how I kind of go about setting each of these individual levels in mono, and how this process can be helpful. So we'll just be leveling the overall volumes for the track in real time here, and I'll be kind of talking you through my process as I'm making these changes. So now we can hop in and start adjusting these levels. So let's turn off everything except for these drums. I'll just go ahead and bypass all these groups, and we can actually bypass all these as well. We'll start off with just our kicks and snares. I have this part looped. Everything is in mono, and we can start adjusting those volume levels. So that's probably good for those kicks and snares. Let's go ahead and drop in those overheads. So let's turn those up to just about there. So that way we kind of have this bright and open sound. It's almost acting like a room mic. So sound pretty nice. We'll have that be a bit louder. Bring in those hi-hats. Definitely too loud. Let's move those so that they kind of sit right behind the snare drum. And listen to what those sound like whenever they're not in mono. You can see we have quite a big stereo change here. There's actually some panning already built into these. But then whenever we move everything back to mono, the stereo information isn't distracting us anymore. We're able to more clearly set those levels. Then we have this really big room mic on our drums. Let's go ahead and bring that down quite a bit. It was a bit overwhelming. Then we can switch off the mono to see where we're at. We're off to a nice balanced sound. Nothing is too loud because everything sounds good in mono. Nothing's jumping out too much. Then once we move everything back to stereo, everything's nice and balanced as well. So you want to make sure it sounds good in both mono and it sounds good in stereo. Now let's open up that percussion and we can set those levels. So you can hear that tambourine is definitely too loud. We could move that shaker just so it sits slightly behind everything. Do the same with the tambourine as well. So you can hear once we move everything back to stereo, these percussion elements sit behind everything in the mix. They're not too out in front of everything, and they're not taking the focus away from the main drum elements. Then we can bring in that bass. So that bass sounds nice, but it's definitely way too loud, so we can bring that down so it kind of sits behind where the kick and snare are. This is what it would sound like in stereo. It actually sounds nice in the case of stereo, but we know that this is way too loud in terms of the balance with the other elements, so we'll go ahead and bring that down. Let's bring in that acoustic guitar. So this is kind of a main element, so we want this to sit more in front of everything. Too loud. Probably have that be right about there. Now let's bring in these electric guitars. We'll start off with the first one. And I want these guitars to sit just behind the acoustic guitar, because that acoustic guitar kind of acts as the main element. Now we'll put these at about the same level because these are basically the same guitar, just multi-tracked. So they got a little bit different distortions on them, but they're basically the same performance. Now we'll jump over to where the guitar solo is, which is in this breakdown. Definitely way too loud. We can bring that down. Now let's bring the level of all those guitars up just slightly. This is always a bit of a trial and error process. There we go, it's sounding a bit more balanced. And last thing I want to do is just drop in this piano. Maybe start at the chorus here. So now because we've adjusted all the levels of the different elements in mono, we have an overall mix that's very balanced. The drums in this case are a little bit more out in front, because that's usually how I like my drums. I like them to be a bit more driving and a bit more in your face. That's just based on personal preference, but you can hear all the different levels, the levels of the acoustic guitar, the piano, the other guitar elements, the bass and percussion here. It's all very balanced and very level sounding, and nothing jumps out and is too in your face, which is something that's quite easy to miss whenever you're not mixing a mono, because the stereo information is very distracting. So by removing this distraction, it makes it a bit more easy to set your levels in a bit more precise fashion. So hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. We'll talk about equalization and mono and how it's helpful.